Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us at Secular AZ today. We are a nonprofit organization focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state for over a decade. This election is 11 days away, and next week we will be speaking with Penny Sheeran about the ballot initiatives that are on everybody's ballot this election cycle. Thank you, Lindsay, for putting those up. We have other events that are at our website, secularaz.org. And Lindsay has been doing a fantastic job of getting some really great speakers. Our Secular Summit is coming up December 10th, and we're working on the programming for that as well. So stay tuned. But today I'm really excited. We are going to be speaking with Professor Greta de Jong. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And she completed her bachelor's and master's degrees in New Zealand and her PhD at Pennsylvania State University. She held a fellowship at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Virginia and is now at the University of Nevada, Reno, where her research and teaching focus on the connections between race and class and the ways that African Americans have fought for economic as well as political rights from the end of Reconstruction through the 21st century. Her current research examines tensions among family, community, and justice that were evident during struggles to desegregate public schools in the mid-20th century United States. And I'm really excited about this. When I first read your bio, I immediately thought of the podcast, Nice White Parents. I think it was the New York Times. I'm sure you've probably heard that podcast, but it was one of those, for me as a lifelong educator, that was really riveting, you know, the privatization and resegregation of our public schools. So welcome, Greta. Is there anything in your bio that I missed?
No, that was really great. And thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course. So I'm just going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Go ahead and share your screen if you need to. And then if you do have any questions for the folks who are in the webinar or maybe on Facebook, by all means, go ahead and type them in. So go ahead, Greta, take it away.
Okay. This talk is actually based on a previous book that I wrote, not my current research, but I'm hoping it'll be interesting to all of you anyway. It was for a book I was working on, looking at plantation counties in the South, trying to see what happened in the rural South after passage of civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s, which restored some political and legal rights to Black Southerners, but didn't do much to address poverty and economic inequality, these problems that had grown out of centuries of racism in that region and across the nation. And those problems were made worse by the mechanization of agriculture in the South and the mass unemployment among farm workers, who were mostly African American. So we need to see the Black freedom movement as also being a fight for economic justice. And these activists in the region and across the nation really lobbied the government to intervene to try to address these economic issues, as well as ensuring equal political and legal rights. And those efforts were opposed by the same white supremacists that had opposed civil rights legislation. So the war on poverty became this kind of arena of struggle between social justice activists and those who are seeking to block progress toward racial equality. And as I'll note toward the end of my talk, this had consequences that affected all of us, not just African Americans. Oops, so my thing's not moving forward. Okay. So just by way of explanation, the War on Poverty was a set of federal anti-poverty initiatives that expanded some existing social programs and also added a lot of new ones. And it aims to really address what a lot of people at the time saw as a major national embarrassment, which was that despite all of the wealth and prosperity that existed in the United States, roughly 40 million Americans, or 22% of the population, lived in poverty in the 1960s. And, they were having problems getting adequate food, clothing, shelter. And it was that sense of embarrassment and the belief that the nation really could do better that led President Lyndon Johnson to declare what he called an unconditional war on poverty in his State of the Union address in January of 1964. And that persuaded Congress to pass the Economic Opportunity Act a few months later in August that same year. So this legislation created a whole slew of new federal programs and agencies trying to attack poverty on multiple fronts, things like adult education and job training, youth employment programs, economic development initiatives, trying to expand access to public assistance programs, volunteer opportunities for people who wanted to try to help end poverty, and mobilizing community resources to fight poverty at the local level. And it created the Office of Economic Opportunity, or the OEO, to coordinate all of this and trying to act as an advocate for poor people in the nation. And then later on, Congress supplemented this with legislation that expanded the food stamp program, which subsidized food purchases for poor families, also established the Medicaid and Medicare programs that provide healthcare to poor people and the elderly, and also created a national network of early childhood education centers known as Head Start, which some people may have heard of. So this generated some hope and optimism that the nation might eventually end poverty and create what Johnson referred to as the Great Society, meaning a nation that gave a comfortable standard of living and economic security for all its citizens. And that didn't happen, as we know. And the failure to end poverty in the 1960s, even though a lot of money was spent on these anti-poverty programs, was used by many people to argue that government action can't solve these problems. So in his State of the Union address in 1988, President Ronald Reagan made the famous statement, quote, "The federal government declared war on poverty and poverty won," kind of dismissing the programs as being ineffective and trying to fix a problem that was beyond government control. And Reagan, as you probably know, and his supporters thought that encouraging private enterprise and giving free rein to market forces could distribute wealth and resources more efficiently than politicians in Washington, D.C. So they saw the war on poverty as just this misguided experiment that wasted a lot of money trying to help poor people who they thought were just too lazy to go and find jobs. And they argued that it did more harm than good by discouraging individual initiative and making people dependent on government assistance. So that became the dominant view of the anti-poverty programs in the 1980s and 1990s. And a lot of people still think of them that way today and make that argument that the government cannot solve these problems. But my research and research by other scholars on this topic tells a little bit of a different story about the war on poverty. I mean, it was true that some of the programs were a little bit flawed and didn't work as expected, but this was not some kind of naive or idealistic crusade that was doomed to failure from the start, as Reagan and some other critics had claimed. In the plantation counties that I studied in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, some of these programs were really successful in lifting poor people out of poverty and putting them on the path to economic independence. And that was something that the plantation owners and business leaders and segregationist politicians who dominated those communities did not want to see. And for that reason, they actively opposed the war on poverty and undermine the effectiveness of anti-poverty programs. So to understand kind of what motivated, here's my cursor. What motivated that opposition? We need to look at what was happening economically and politically in the South in the 1950s and 1960s, where for centuries, first under slavery and then under Jim Crow, Black Southerners had been subjected to all kinds of oppression that were designed to maintain a cheap supply of labor for plantation owners. And during the Jim Crow era, white supremacists limited Black people's access to education, prevented them from voting, shut them out of higher paying jobs, and used extreme violence to prevent them from protesting that mistreatment. So most Black families worked as sharecroppers on plantations owned by white people, and they lived off credit that was extended to them by their employers, which was often used to keep them perpetually in debt. And it really forced them to depend on their employers for food and clothing and housing and other basic necessities of life. And that economic dependence was another way that white Southerners were able to control people, and it prevented them from stepping out of line, because if you were evicted from the plantation, you lost everything. You lost your house, you lost access to land and credit. Basically, you lost access to everything that was needed to survive. That sharecropping system began to be disrupted during the Great Depression in the 1930s, when the federal government put in place some policies that tried to stabilize the agricultural economy by regulating production and paying farmers to take some of their land out of cultivation. So that meant that plantation owners didn't need so much labor, and a lot of the landowners invested the money they received from the government in tractors and other machinery that reduced the need for workers even more. So plantation owners began laying off and evicting these sharecroppers and other farm laborers. And this process of displacement continued over the next few decades through World War II and into the 1960s and 1970s. And the pace of evictions and layoffs, we see a real pickup in that in the 1950s and 1960s during the civil rights movement, because planters were retaliating against people who were involved in that movement. And they also evicted a lot of families who were not involved as well. There was just a final push to get rid of their Black workers. Once it became clear that Congress was going to pass civil rights legislation and that Black sharecroppers would soon be able to vote, a lot of white Southerners decided they needed to reduce the number of African Americans living in their communities, especially in those plantation counties where Black people were the majority of voters, people of voting age, and they looked set to soon be able to vote white people out of power in those counties. So displacement, began for economic reasons, and during the civil rights era, there were political motivations behind it as well. So between 1930 and 1970, the number of Black people employed in agriculture in the South declined by around 90%, from 881,000 to around 90,000. So that gives you a sense of how dramatic these economic transformations were and the impact on people's employment prospects. It was really difficult for displaced farm workers to find other jobs because industrial development in the South had traditionally been very limited, and there weren't a lot of alternatives to farm labor for these workers. And even where new industries did exist, former sharecroppers often didn't have the education and skills to be hired for those jobs. And state and local governments weren't very interested in helping displaced workers to adjust, because they really just wanted all these unemployed poor people to leave the South and become someone else's problem. And things like social welfare programs and job training programs were expensive. And one of the biggest fears that white people had about Black people being able to vote was that African Americans would gain political control in their counties and start raising taxes to pay for things like improvements to the schools and better social services and other programs to help poor people. So a leader of the Citizens Council, which was a segregationist group that was set up in the 1950s to oppose the civil rights movement, warns people in Mississippi that if the Voting Rights Act passed and Black people were voted into office, he thought landowners would see tax increases of, quote, 100%, 200% or more. And a man in Alabama wrote to his senator to say that if Southern counties were taken over by Black people, then, quote, the South's only alternative is going to be to stop employing Negroes and force them to immigrate to the industrial centers up north, thus transferring their tremendous burdens of welfare costs, illiteracy, etc., to the citizens up there. So there was this real push to just get rid of African Americans from these counties. And civil rights workers in the South reported that along with all the violence and intimidation that they were encountering from segregationists, the political leaders in the South were deliberately trying to encourage Black outmigration by opposing job training and economic development, and also denying access and cutting people off public assistance programs so that these unemployed workers would really just have no options except to leave. So civil rights activists publicized this. They were publicizing hunger and homelessness among displaced agricultural workers in the South, as you can see in this poster with pictures of starving children. Trying to get people to do something about it. And the publicity and pressure from civil rights activists was one of the things that pushed Congress to pass the Economic Opportunity Act in 1964. And I just want to show you a clip of President Johnson explaining why he thought this legislation was necessary. So this is from his, I can't find my cursor. Okay, so this is from his special message to Congress in March of 1965. And he's kind of explaining why this legislation is needed.
All Americans must have the privileges of citizenship, regardless of race. And they are going to have those privileges of citizenship, regardless of race. But I would like to caution you and remind you that to exercise these privileges takes much more than just legal right. It requires a trained mind and a healthy body. It requires a decent home and the chance to find a job and the opportunity to escape from the clutches of poverty. Of course, people cannot contribute to the nation if they are never taught to read or write. If their bodies are stunted from hunger, if their sickness goes untended, if their life is spent in hopeless poverty, just drawing a welfare check. So we want to open the gates to opportunity. But we're also going to give all our people, Black and white, the help that they need to walk through those gates.
So you can see how Johnson and other Americans had come to see that political rights were only part of the solution, and that to fully participate as citizens, people really needed some kind of economic security. And another thing to note in that clip is his statement that this should mean something other than just depending on a government welfare check. And that's really significant because one of the goals of the War on Poverty was to move away from that kind of system and to really pioneer some new approaches to solving poverty. So one of the most
All
Oh, sorry, I want to move on. Okay. So one of the most innovative aspects of the war on poverty was the community action programs that were set up. And the idea behind this was that poor people themselves, sorry, okay, poor people themselves were best understood their own problems and what to do about them. So rather than sending in social workers or government bureaucrats to tell people what they should do, the goal was to really give poor people a chance to design and operate any anti-poverty programs themselves. And this led to some really creative and successful projects that were initiated by poor people in communities across the nation. And it was especially important for Black Southerners because it allowed community groups to bypass their racist state and local politicians and apply directly to the Office of Economic Opportunity for funds. So in the 1960s, the OEO provided hundreds of grants to community groups to provide services like adult education programs and job training, legal services, health clinics, help for small business development, housing construction, basically whatever poor people thought their communities needed, they could apply for a CAP grant to fund it. And the programs had the effect of but they both provided really vital services to poor people that they needed. And they also employed poor people in the programs to run them at the same time. And one program that I studied in Mississippi that was really successful was the Tufts Delta Health Center in Bolivar County. It was funded by the Office of Economic Opportunity. And it's a real demonstration of how government programs could transform people's lives and help solve some of these broader problems that they were facing in their communities as well. And the activists who started it wanted to go beyond just providing health services to people. They really wanted to try to address the root causes of illness among people in the region, which were environmental, like things like not being able to afford to buy food and living in cold and leaky shacks with no running water and no sanitation, that kind of thing. And they also put a really heavy emphasis on local participation and control. So they went out and they talked to people and asked them, what do you need? And they found that everyone thought providing healthcare was a really good idea, but their biggest problem was just getting enough food. And since most of them were former sharecroppers and they knew how to farm, they said they would happily grow food if they could get access to land. So with help from some northern donors and funding from the OEO, 900 families joined together and they set up a cooperative farm where they grew vegetables for themselves and for other low-income people, and that effectively solved the hunger problem in the health center service area. And then the health center was set up and it provided jobs to people, and jobs there and at the co-op freed people from dependence on white employers or public assistance, and then that economic independence allowed them to participate in the political process without fearing reprisals. And so more people registered to vote, Black candidates ran for office, and people were generally able to just take a more active role in efforts to improve conditions in the community. So that's just one example of a community action program that worked. And there were lots of other examples as well across the nation. They really demonstrated that poor people knew what they needed. They weren't lazy or stupid or lacking an initiative. And it just took a small investment of resources to enable them to solve some really pressing problems in their communities. But projects like the TDHC still faced a lot of opposition, and the community action programs were constantly attacked and maligned by people who could see that they were working all too well and who just wanted to put a stop to it. And a lot of this opposition came from the same segregationist organizations and political leaders that had opposed the civil rights movement. So the Citizens Council, which was the monthly magazine, the Citizens Council put out a monthly magazine called The Citizen, which constantly carried stories about waste and corruption and fraud in anti-poverty programs, most of them exaggerated or distorted or just completely made up. If you were to read The Citizen in the 1960s, you would think that CAP directors were embezzling millions of dollars from these programs, and that the government was helping poor people to buy homes that resembled palaces with intercom systems that piped music into every room. That was one story they put in there. Or that food stamp recipients could be seen on a daily basis pulling up to stores in their late model Cadillacs and driving away with grocery bags full of steaks and other expensive food items. In reality, the programs were regularly audited, and even though investigators sometimes found kind of shoddy record keeping or inaccurate accounting, deliberate fraud or misuse of federal funds in anti-poverty programs was very rare. One study of the war on poverty in Alabama by the historian Susan Ashmore found that fraud was most likely to happen in the CAPs that were being run by state and local officials. Like, these were people who had a long history of corruption and often used federal money to enrich themselves and their friends instead of helping poor people. So they got their hands on anti-poverty money and they used it in the same way they had it in the past, in very corrupt ways. And the most effective, the most well-operated CAPs were those like the Tufts Delta Health Clinic, where the federal funds went directly to grassroots organizations and bypassed those local officials. But those sort of more independent CAPs, those were exactly the ones that opponents of these programs were most likely to accuse of fraud and abuse, because they were doing such a good job of empowering poor people. So there's a real pattern that scholars have noticed who are working in this field, where a group of poor people will come up with some genius idea to solve a problem and receive funding from the OEO, and that would create jobs and provide social services for poor people and inspire political action like voting and running for office, which threatened the interests of local political and business leaders who would respond by accusing the CAP administrators of misusing federal funds. And then the federal officials would come and investigate. They would find no wrongdoing. But in the meantime, funds were frozen for several months. And then local newspapers would be full of stories suggesting that something shady was going on at the CAP. And that made it hard to operate the programs and tended to undermine people's confidence in them. And this happened repeatedly, especially in the South. And the OEO faced constant pressure from state governors and congressional representatives to investigate CAPs for fraud. And they sometimes just caved into political pressure to shut programs down, even when the investigations found nothing wrong with the way that they were being managed. So all these charges of fraud and corruption tended to dampen support for the war on poverty. And opponents also set out to convince people that the programs weren't really necessary, arguing that poor people were poor because of their own individual actions, and they just weren't making wise choices and decisions. And one of the strangest arguments I came across along these lines was in a document. It was a response by the state welfare commissioner in Louisiana, where people had been raising concerns about widespread hunger among poor people in Louisiana. And in a press release, he stated that he had contacted local officials and welfare workers and found no cases of people going hungry because of lack of food. He said, just some children who were malnourished because of, quote, the ignorance or neglect of their parents. And he quoted one doctor as saying, quote, if there were anyone starving or malnourished, it was strictly through choice and not poverty. So it's kind of like an extreme example of individual responsibility for poverty by choosing to be poor. Another argument made by opponents of anti-poverty programs was that unemployment and other social problems were caused by so-called natural laws of economics that were beyond anyone's control. So some people opposed economic development in depressed areas because they thought those places just lacked the natural resources and trade centers to encourage businesses to locate there. And there was nothing anyone could do about that. And in Coahoma County in Mississippi, OEO officials who spoke with one of the area's leading white residents found out that he opposed the war on poverty because he thought it messed with natural economic forces that would eventually force poor people, for poor Black people to leave if the government would just leave things alone. So all of these arguments were a convenient way for Southern political and economic leaders to avoid dealing with a social crisis that they had created by denying educational and economic opportunities to Black people in the Jim Crow era and evicting them from the plantations when their labor was no longer needed, and then refusing to fund social welfare services or retraining programs to help all of those displaced workers. So rather than admitting that their own decisions played a role in any of this, they instead were portraying unemployment and poverty either as character flaws or lifestyle choices or as naturally occurring phenomena that no one could do anything about. So this implied that social programs were useless and kind of like an unnecessary form of government intervention in the economy, as opposed to being a moral obligation to make sure that people whose lives were disrupted by economic restructuring received assistance. If the economy just ran itself and each person's success or failure just depended on their own individual choices, poverty could be blamed on poor people themselves instead of being kind of linked to a system that exploited workers and denied them opportunities. And as racist organizations like the Citizens Council constantly reminded people, it was often Black people who were poor, and segregationists were very effective in defining poverty as a Black problem in the 1960s and giving people the impression that the war on poverty was taking money away from hardworking white taxpayers and giving it to lazy, undeserving Black people instead. But poverty, of course, was not just a Black problem, and these attacks on anti-poverty programs did not just affect African Americans. Black people were disproportionately poor relative to their numbers in the population because of racism and their position in the economy, but numerically, the vast majority of poor people were white, and they always have been, and they suffered along with poor Black people when Congress began cutting back on funding for these programs in the late 1960s and 1970s. And at the same time, these ideas that white supremacists were promoting in response to the unemployment crisis in the South in the 1960s influenced the national response to economic dislocations that affected a lot of other workers across the nation in the decades afterwards. So in the 1970s and 1980s, millions of workers in older manufacturing industries like steel and automaking lost their jobs as the nation transitioned to a post-industrial, more globalized economy. And just like the displaced agricultural workers in the South in the 1960s, these workers could have benefited from an expansion in anti-poverty initiatives. But by this time, segregationist arguments against the war on poverty had made their way into the mainstream of economic thinking, and national political leaders were using them to roll back federal intervention in the economy. So Presidents Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter both pushed less government spending and more reliance on the private sector to try to solve social problems. And Ronald Reagan's attacks on Great Society programs and the welfare state more generally often drew on a lot of the myths developed by Southern segregationists, including references to Black welfare queens who were supposedly defrauding taxpayers, public housing developments that were equipped with the most modern amenities, and lazy unemployed people who used food stamps to buy T-bone steaks. Those all made appearances in Reagan's speeches as he was campaigning. So Reagan convinced a lot of Americans that their problems stemmed from too much government spending on social programs and too much regulation of business, and he promised to restore prosperity through policies that transferred money out of the public sector and put it back into the private sector where he thought it belonged. So under his presidency, corporations and wealthy individuals received roughly $750 billion in tax cuts, while almost every federal program that helped unemployed workers and low-income families was scaled back or eliminated altogether. Those policies led to increasing economic insecurity for many people, not just low-income families, but for middle-class people as well. The tax cuts and deregulation allowed wealth to accumulate in the form of private fortunes at the top of the income scale instead of being reinvested in things like education or job training, healthcare, infrastructure, things that could benefit everyone. And they generated massive inequality to the point where by 2019, just 3 billionaires together owned as much wealth as the bottom 50% of Americans combined. And of course, as this small group of super rich Americans profited exponentially, a lot of middle-class families were struggling to afford housing, health insurance, college tuition, retirement savings accounts, and then there were poorer people who can't afford even basic necessities like food and clothing. So that has really taken a toll on people, and it just demonstrates how the actions of white supremacists who denigrated and dismantled anti-poverty programs in the 1960s had a lasting impact on people across the United States. And in that sense, if I were to answer the question, who lost the war on poverty, I would just say, in that sense, we all did. We all suffered from what happened in the 1960s. So that is all I have. I'll stop sharing, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to check the chat as I was going along, but I'll take a look now, see what's happening there.
Diane Post is our head of legal and one of our board members here for Secular AZ, and she had some comments about the similarities. Sounds just like what DeSantis, Ducey, and Texas governor are doing, sending their problems, those seeking asylum to the north, and because of those, because of those busloads of asylum seekers and refugees, it's really brought up the topic of the reverse, the reverse busing, right? A lot of people, I don't think, really even knew about that until these political using actual human beings as a political tool to portray them in a certain way. She also says Black freedmen who stayed were forced onto the least desirable land in the South outside of the plantation lands. They built communities there, and those are now the places like Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Diane also says Black farmers are still suing about never receiving their equal share of the various farm programs. And it sounds like when you were talking about the fake news, like this hysteria of, it's the poor people's fault. They are choosing to live in poverty without any contextualization or acknowledgement of wealth accumulation in a capitalist society. So if anybody does have any questions, by all means, go ahead and put them into the Q&A. One thing that I thought of when you were speaking, Dr. de Jong, was, this idea of welfare queens. I come from a very small town in the Midwest, where there are virtually no Black people at all, but this narrative exists of, quote unquote welfare queens and how they're just gaming the system and that kind of stuff. And I wanted to ask you about, because Reagan, his policies have definitely had a lasting effect. And one thing that I wanted to ask you about was, I believe it was Ronald Reagan who changed how we treat people with severe mental illness. And I wonder about the connection between, folks who are struggling with severe mental illness, who probably need some kind of, real mental health treatment, and it all suddenly being taken away in the 1980s. Can you speak? I don't know if that's something that you really focus on in your research, but can you speak to that a little bit and how that is connected to, with folks living in poverty and these kinds of attacks and the over incarceration of people with mental illness?
Yeah. I don't know the specifics. I just sort of have a vague general idea that it was in the 1980s that a lot of mental health institutions were shut down, or that the federal government stopped funding institutions and instead was trying to initiate different approaches to mental health, but they didn't put anything in place to replace those institutions. And so a lot of mentally ill people just ended up on the streets without any assistance at all. So that's the only thing I know. I sort of just vaguely remember it from reading. The other people in the audience might know more. I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, someone's put a link in the chat. So.
Oh, perfect. Good. Yeah, I just read something recently. We have some really fantastic reporters for the Arizona Republic, Joseph Joffrey and Jimmy Jenkins, and they did a large, 5-part series about incarceration in Arizona, because in Arizona, we incarcerate more, I want to say more than any other state. Our politicians in this state have also, opened the doorways for private prisons, and it's a wonderful series that documents what's actually happening in our carceral system here in Arizona. And I was really shocked by how many people who are struggling with mental illness are those who are incarcerated. Like, that's just become the replacement for people with mental illness. I had a question there, and it left me.
Yeah, no, if I can just comment, there is a really great book. I can't remember, but the title kind of explains it all. It's called From the War on Poverty to the War on Drugs. Sort of how in the 70s and 80s, the focus to addressing poverty and unemployment shifted from trying to provide social programs and social services to just locking people up. So, the way to deal with unemployment was just to arrest people and incarcerate them. And then, with the rise of private prisons, that became a very profitable industry, which makes it very hard to get rid of, or to try different approaches if people are making money off it.
And it's essentially an extension of slavery, The expose written in the Arizona Republic talked about, there are prisoners, incarcerated people in Arizona who are making pennies an hour. And we have municipalities and corporations who are taking advantage of that. And I know that when I read the articles, I was absolutely outraged. And I feel like if more people were aware of how their tax dollars were being spent to fund this prison industrial complex, they would be outraged. But then at the same time, the three main speaking points, at least here in Arizona, are, crime, from the conservatives is there's a rise in crime. We've got to protect the border, and inflation. And those, they don't really offer solutions, but they talk about the problems quite frequently. But, we have contracts in place with these private prisons in Arizona where they have to guarantee the private prisons, a certain amount of beds and funding. And there actually isn't enough crime to justify that. And so it really is, it's run rampant here. And I know in many other states as well. Diane says there are huge disparities in wealth. She says huge disparities in wealth will always create a society with crime because it creates a society of need. Absolutely.
Yeah. The other thing with the prison industrial complex is that a lot of prisons are located in these rural areas that are heavily white. And so, it's a way to divide people by race. Again, you hire poor white people to be prison guards in these prisons, and that gives them jobs, and just lock up all the Black and brown people. And also the prisoners are counted in the population counts for those counties and states, and it gives them disproportionate representation in Congress as a result. And it's like an echo of the 3/5 clause, in the way that it has, given these regions more power, more political power relative to their population than they should have. And then it takes away that population from the places where those prisoners originated to, which were often urban areas.
I'd say this every Friday, I feel like, because we have some incredible speakers, and the academic work that you're doing, and I know Lindsay put links up for your books, is so important, but it's also awfully depressing. So if perhaps you could maybe give us some hope for the weekend, what can folks do who are frustrated by these narratives? Just pick yourself up by the bootstraps. Meanwhile, corporate welfare seems to be perfectly acceptable. I did love the fact that President Biden called out the folks who were receiving those PPP loans, right? And in contrast with the student loan forgiveness. And we need more of that, but especially in today's day and age, with Fox News and social media echo chambers, how can you maybe give us a little bit of hope?
Yeah, no, that just reminds me of all these plantation owners denigrating anti-poverty programs as being a waste of money, but they were themselves raking in millions of dollars in agricultural subsidies. I guess I find hope in just the long-term freedom struggle, which began with slavery and is continuing in the present. And even when it seems like nothing is happening, there are always local organizations working to continue the struggle. And I just resign myself to the fact that it's never ending. And sometimes there's progress and then it gets rolled back, and you just pick yourself up and just keep trying to work for progress and encourage your family and friends to do the same thing. The most important thing we can do now is vote in these elections at every level. As I'm sure you know, there are election deniers on the ballot, people who want to take control of local and state elections, and basically, destroy democracy in the United States. So that's a top priority for this weekend, is to vote if there's early voting. And do you guys have early voting in Arizona?
We do. I mean, there were over 100 bills this legislative session in Arizona to restrict a person's ability to vote, person's freedom to vote. Thankfully, many of them weren't passed into law, but I guarantee the attacks will continue. And, Arizona is also getting national attention right now because we have so many election deniers running for statewide office, whether it's the governor, the secretary of state. So Yeah, Andrew Seidel posted something on Twitter yesterday. There was this, I think it was a city council meeting somewhere in Tennessee, where a woman, because they were talking about LGBTQ restrictions, and she just said all the things that we're all thinking. She went off on this at this meeting, and it went viral. And he said, when people ask me what we need to do to combat Christian nationalism, this is it. And he threw up that video, and that's it. We need to show up at our school board meetings, city council meetings, legislative meetings, all of that. And like you said, and this is a group I know that is going to vote, and probably many of them are contributing their time, talent, and treasure to the really great candidates that we have from school board to governor. So that's the general message these past few weeks on our Friday discussions. So is there anything that you would like to put into the chat? Or I know that Lindsay's already done some of that, but is there anything else that you'd like to promote right now?
No, just generally, people working on African American history are doing such a great job. So I just encourage people to read whatever they can and whatever interests them. And also thanks to Diane for pointing out that the freedom struggle began earlier. I was thinking the Black freedom movement with Africans being imported, but you're right, there was the broader freedom struggle of just for basic fundamental human rights and access to the things that we need, of course, began a lot earlier. So yeah.
Well, I sure do appreciate you joining us today. It was a really great discussion. I appreciate everybody for showing up, and the hope that we have is at the ballot box and on all of these races. So thank you, Dr. de Jong. I appreciate you.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks everyone for attending and your great questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Everybody have a great weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.